Welcome to the World United. Welcome to the World United.
Perfect. Thank you, Malcolm.
Hi.
Enjoy.
My name is Malcolm-Huxter and I'm a clinical psychologist and a teacher of Buddhist meditation. And today in this presentation I'd like to present something about the Four Noble Truths. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to presenting this talk, which is essentially about the transformation of suffering to mental well-being and psychological freedom, which of course refers to genuine happiness and a sense of connection with oneself and all beings. So we find that life is a process of cause-effect relationships. We live in relationships. It's a context of interdependent relationships. And this means that we are all connected in some way or other. Every action has a consequence, and every action affects ourselves and others in some way or other. Sometimes we relate to ourselves and the world with wisdom, with awareness, kindness, and care. And sometimes we relate to ourselves and the world with confusion, hatred, high self-criticism, and self-loathing. Perhaps two very important relationships that we can find in the world is a relationship between suffering and its causes, and freedom from suffering and the cause of this. It's suffering and its causes seems to be driven by greed, ignorance, and hatred. And freedom from suffering, a sense of psychological well-being and happiness, is of course driven or based on a relationship of awareness, goodwill, harmony, kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. So what we find in the Buddha's Four Noble Truths are these two cause-effect relationships. The first truth is that there is dukkha, or suffering. Sometimes a better way of describing dukkha, which is the term the Buddha used, is unsatisfactoriness. Essentially, it is this experience of distress, discontent, dissatisfaction that ranges from the gross, which includes the difficulties we experience with birth, aging, sickness, and death, to the subtle experiences that include just that subtle dissatisfaction of not getting what we want exactly as we want it. So, dukkha includes a whole range of difficult experiences, and I think that we need to acknowledge that the world is in dukkha at the moment, and also we ourselves experience dukkha. So coming back to these four truths, there is dukkha. This is a reality of life, and the second truth is that dukkha has a cause, and the causes I'll go into in a little while. The wonderful thing is that there is freedom from dukkha as well. There is freedom from suffering. And there also is a way to find freedom. There's a path. There's a way of living and being that is free, free in itself. So I was talking earlier about the first reality, this first reality of dukkha, and I mentioned earlier that it includes the difficulties associated with birth, aging, sickness, and death. It includes pain, which includes all emotional pain, grief, lamentation, and despair, getting what you don't want, not getting what you want, and being parted from that which is close to you. In fact, at a very subtle end, it includes clinging to a sense of separate self, a separate self that feels permanent, lasting, fixed, and solid. A disconnected, separate, individual. So this in and of itself is dukkha. This sense of separation and isolation and disconnection is in and itself dukkha. The second truth, which refers to the causes of suffering or the origins of suffering, relates to greed, ignorance and hatred. Greed refers to addictions, craving after, grasping after, clinging to pleasant experiences. Ignorance refers to delusion about and ignoring the reality of things, misperceiving things, misapprehending things, just generally being confused about the way things actually are. And hatred refers to rejection, fear, condemnation, avoidance, pushing away of experiences that need not be avoided, need not be pushed away. Experiences in life where we have a sense of strong condemnation about it. That's rejection and condemnation. The third truth, as I mentioned earlier, in Buddhism is called nibbana or nirvana, and literally this word means being unbound. One is unbound from the causes of suffering. So at both relative and ultimate levels, it means freedom. This third truth means freedom from suffering, or freedom from dukkha. And as I'll explain in a little while, this freedom can be both relative and ultimate. And the Buddha's awakening was about noble ultimate freedom from dukkha. Yet, as a clinical psychologist, I work with a kind of relative freedom. What we find is, to the extent that we can release the second truth, release the causes of suffering, to that extent we can discover freedom. So what can happen is that at both relative and ultimate levels, our cycles or our patterns of suffering, our patterns of dukkha, things that keep us bound in this, in our unhappiness, can be released, can be short-circuited. And in Buddhism, this is called nirvana, as I mentioned. It is also called the highest happiness. It's an experience of being completely connected, and it's the result of the fourth truth, actually, which is travelling on the path of the Eightfold Path towards Nibbana. So the fourth truth involves cultivating that which is helpful, cultivating that which is wholesome, and letting go or abandoning or short-circuiting or extinguishing that which is unhelpful, that which is unwholesome. And this is all workable. We find that the Eightfold Path is represents the fourth truth, and what we have in the Eightfold Path is wisdom, which refers to right view and right intention, ethics, right action, right livelihood and right speech, and meditation, which involves right effort, right balanced effort, diligence, right mindfulness and right concentration. So these Four Noble Truths are an example of what the Buddha called dependent arising. And dependent arising is the principle behind the way freedom works, and also it's the principle behind how we get entangled in our cycles of suffering. And it's quite complicated, but in the suttas it's simply said like this: when this is, that is. Because this arises, that arises. When this is not, that is not. Because this ceases, that ceases. So it is as if when we no longer have the causes of suffering, we no longer feed into our suffering with greed, ignorance and hatred, then suffering no longer arises. And if we can do the opposite of that, do the opposite of feeding into our suffering, in fact, practicing the Eightfold Path, for example, practicing generosity, kindness, living ethically, developing our attention, developing our minds, our hearts, and so on, then we work against that movement towards suffering. As a psychologist, I work in I work with a number of different approaches. And there's a saying in ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. If I continue to do what I've always done, I'm going to get what I've always got. That's a really cool saying. It is indicative of what happens in the independent arising. Because if we continue to do what we've always done and results in suffering, we're going to continue to experience suffering. If, however, we can do something different, if, however, we can, rather than approach experiences in our lives with greed, ignorance, and hatred, then we can experience something different. We can experience freedom, connection, awakening. So these 4 truths can be adapted to a whole range of issues in life. As a psychologist, I adapt them to clinical problems, for example. And in this way, you could say that there are presenting problems or disorders, there are causative factors for how and why these problems may have developed, and maintaining processes to keep the problems arising. And the third truth, it is possible to be free from the problems, or the issues, or the what we call mental disorders, or at least reduce the severity of the symptoms. And the fourth truth, the path, is that there are treatments that use therapeutic relationship, cognitive, behavioural and affective strategies to address the causative factors and the maintaining processes. So in this way we can understand this dynamic of the 4 truths in a clinical sense. So often we cause ourselves a lot of suffering in the way we relate to erroneous thoughts, for example. Sometimes we just live in our heads. Sometimes we identify and take painful emotions personally. And we misunderstand and misperceive events. And we get caught in reactive cycles. So all these patterns lead to kind of an entanglement and an entrenchment in dissatisfaction, mental dukkha, basically. So if we do something different, if we engage in mindfulness, if we engage in concentration, if we engage in living an ethical life, if we apply our wisdom, then we can find a sense of freedom from our own personal suffering. And at global levels, you can see these patterns as well, and I'm just picking climate change here. So climate change is real, and it is dukkha. And if you think about the second truth, there are human-related causative and maintenance factors for climate change. These include beliefs, attitudes and behaviours that make it worse. The third truth is that it is possible to find a sustainable ecological balance, and there are actions we can all do that can mitigate the crisis. Same with COVID-19, and this is a big subject. I wrote a paper on this in April. There is the suffering of COVID-19, and it is immense. And you can see that greed, ignorance and hatred at global levels has been at least partially causative of this, which includes our human intrusion on natural habitats. And it also maintains the suffering, which includes the way we're approaching this, the way we're dealing with this. It is possible to be free from the personal suffering of COVID-19, and it is also possible to live in harmony with nature in a COVID-safe world. So that's the third truth. And the fourth truth being there are ways to find personal psychological freedom in amongst this difficult situation with COVID-19. And there are also ways to live in ecological balance with nature at a collective and global level. So I've come to the end of my 15 minutes now. I hope it's been helpful. I trust that we can all live a path of freedom and well-being and connection. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in this conference.